Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick. How are you guys? It's really high time I spoke about all these generic upgrades from X-Wing 2nd Edition. We had the last two conversion kits spoiled last week, so now we have information on every single generic upgrade that goes across all three factions. Now first up, a quick apology, I'm not going to record facecam for this one and my voice might be a little bit croaky. I'm a little bit under the weather and the weather that I am talking about is here in Melbourne and really friggin' cold. So without further ado, let's make our way through these, starting with A for Astromech. And Astromechs have now become universal across the Scum and Rebel faction. There's no longer Astromechs and salvaged Astromechs. The reason there was two different kinds in the original game was Scum didn't exist when they were first designed, and when Scum came in, there were all these unique Astromechs like R2-D2 that couldn't go on the Scum faction, and they didn't want to errata all the old cards. They just made a whole new card type. Now it's nice and clean. There's these 4 Astromechs that can go on either faction. First up, R2 Astromech, and I've included along the bottom here all the first edition cards that kind of copy the design of these new cards. It's not always the exact same card and card name, some of them actually borrow designs from more than one different card, but in terms of how it evolved in 2nd edition, I want to speak mainly in this video about design. We don't have costings yet, so it's a bit hard to judge power level, so let's focus on the design. R2 Astromech being similar in design to the old R2-D2 card, except R2 Astromech prevents you from being able to shoot the turn you use him. Plus, he only works twice. So you can see here that yes, we have generic regen across the Scum and Rebel faction, but it's really dialed back. I think a lot of you guys can agree that R2-D2 led to a lot of negative play experience. Giving a player agency to regen shields and still shoot and defend, fully modified with no downside whatsoever, was a pretty big deal in 1st edition. So having a nice powered down, watered down version of that is good. And if you're taking weapons disable token, a good aggressive opponent will punish you for using this. This is not the free regen that we used to see in 1st edition. And it's great to see it across the Scum faction as well. I think it's fair enough. If it's going to be watered down to this extent, it can be a generic thing across the two factions. It's not something we see on Imperials, but Imperials are more high risk, high reward in terms of just trying to avoid being shot at all. Rebels and Scum tend to use ship frames that can take a bit of punishment, so it's more in fitting with their factions. R3 Astromech has taken the design a weapons engineer, meaning now that far fewer ships have access to this ability, including none of the Empire ships. Which is interesting, it really never saw that much play, but considering we can lock friendly ships and asteroids and there are utilities that go around with both, this might have a few nice combos with some pilots that will be coming out. Be interesting to see whether we have any resistance pilots that can use this combo. R4 Astromech has taken both the design of R2 Astromech and Unhinged Astromech and given a nice watered down, softer approach to both of these. Unhinged Astromech in particular in 1st edition was a huge design issue. It is the entire reason why the Jump Master has S-loops at speed 2 instead of speed 3, being able to change any of those maneuvers at that speed to green, even R2 Astromech to some extent. If, for example, FFG wanted to put a 2-speed Talon roll in the X-Wing, they wouldn't be able to because making a red special maneuver green is very powerful and arguably broken. And the great thing about R4 Astromech is it only reduces the difficulty and only does it on basic maneuvers as well. So if there is any red in the basic maneuvers on speed 1 2, they only become white, which is a nice, fair and balanced approach for every ship that can take it. R5 Astromech has become a little bit more consistent but a little bit less powerful. You have to use an action in order to flip your damage cards face down, but you do not get this ability for free, which can potentially dig a pilot out of really bad situations with no effort on their part. So having to spend an action feels like a much more balanced way of doing this. Now, when we're talking about bombs in 2nd edition, these basically have all had subtle changes. One of the biggest things about all of these is these are all dropped during the system phase, which occurs before the activation phase. In other words, this occurs before any ship gets to fly. If you want to learn a bit more about this, guys, I made a video on this the other day talking about the timing and the implications of moving forward with this in 2nd edition. Click the annotation up here to see this. But one of the key things is the bomblet generator now no longer works infinitely. You have to spend shields in order to recur those charges. And when suffering damage from it, you only get regular hits. You cannot suffer crits from it like you did in 1st edition. Proton Bombs, instead of just dealing face-up damage cards, gives a critical hit, which in many situations will be exactly the same effect, but it means it can't go through shields, which is arguably something we don't want to see too much of. It's a very spiky effect to have in the game. Seismic Charges still has the same effect when it detonates, however it latches onto a nearby asteroid, which is very interesting. It also removes that asteroid. And I gotta say, I like this as a flavor win. It really reminds me of what goes on in episode 2 when Obi-Wan's chasing Jango Fett through the minefield and it sort of floats around and hits an asteroid and makes that really, really cool sound effect. So great flavor win there. Proxy Mines is exactly the same. Instead of rolling 3 dice, you just roll 2. And Connonet is also exactly the same. Instead of taking 2 ion tokens, you take 3. The old Connonet could ionize any ship that it hits, same as the new Connonet, so that makes perfect sense. We've got a bunch of generic crew that can go onto any faction, starting off with Freelance Slicer. This is kind of similar to ISB Slicer in that it gives you the ability to jam ships. While you defend, before the attack dice are rolled, you may spend a lock you have on the attacker to roll 1 attack die. If you do, the attacker gains 1 jam token. Then on a hit or crit result, gain 1 jam token. And this basically means you can prevent your opponent from having modified dice against your ship. You also run the risk of maybe not being able to modify your own dice. In fact, there's a 1 in 2 chance that happens. But maybe your ship doesn't have tokens anyway. Maybe you put this on a build that doesn't rely on that kind of strategy. And in those scenarios, I quite like this idea. If you're all about offense, this could be a great utility card. Gonk Droid has moved from the Scum faction to all factions and is now no longer unique. But apart from that is a functional reprint. The text here on both cards works exactly the same, except we're using the language of charges. And I see a lot of Imperial players being very interested in this. I just want to warn you guys, this in first edition was pretty terrible. I don't want to stomp on anyone's dreams here, but using 2 actions to recover 1 hit point is not really a good rate most of the time. Especially considering there's not a lot of action stacking in second edition, so just be careful. This card might be a bit of a trap, but if there's a build that can really abuse it, maybe one day in the future it'll be good. Informant has replaced Intel Agent, and this is very, very interesting because now Informant only works against one particular ship. You need to deal the listing device condition to your opponent, and then during the system phase, if they're near the ship with the Informant, they flip their dial face up, which makes it a much more narrow effect. I think this is fair enough. I think Intel Agent at a 1 point cost in the crew slot was an excellent rate in first edition. I can see this being around the same amount of points, maybe even a tad more. I still think this is going to be fantastic. There'll be games where this is terrible if you're fighting against like a TIE Swarm or something like that. You're not really going to care where one of those TIE fighters is going, especially if they have a lower initiative than your ships. Novice Technician's an interesting one, pretty much a new design here. At the end of the round, you may roll 1 attack die to repair 1 face-up damage card. Then on a hit result, expose 1 damage card. And this feels like a high-risk, high-reward card we generally expect on the Scum faction, but I guess Rebel and Empire can take this too. Seems very strange on the Empire. They don't really play around with that much risk with their faction, but yeah, whatever. Seems like an okay effect. It'll be very helpful if there's 1 damage card wrecking you, but I can't see this seeing too much meta play, unless it's absolutely dirt cheap. Perceptive Copilot has replaced Recon Spec word for word. Seasoned Navigator is basically stay on target for the crew slot. Now, I actually had a chat about stay on target recently in a video about EPTs that we will not see in second edition. And a few of you guys pointed out, hey, Seasoned Navigator is actually that same effect. But I do want to point out to you guys that it's a very, very different beast being on the crew slot rather than the talent slot. The crew slot is something that only specific ships have, while the talent slot is on almost every single ship. In fact, several ships that may not have had the talent slot in first edition probably have it in second edition. We know, for example, the Y-Wing on the Rebel faction does have talent slots. And I think stay on target may have just been a bit too problematic with initiative being so important in second edition. Making this a utility card for the crew slot on ships that don't tend to be aces is very interesting. I'm looking at this card in particular and wondering whether or not the TIE Phantom will still have a crew slot. And I'm going to guess no, because it seems like giving aces these kinds of crew abilities can be a bit problematic. I might be wrong, that might be a bit too harsh on the TIE Phantom, but I just get that impression seeing as the kind of design choices we're seeing so far. Tactical Officer no longer just gives any Imperial ship a coordinate action. He now gives any ship with a crew slot that already has a red coordinate a coordinate. And this is a pretty common design we're seeing. We're not seeing cards that just give ships certain actions like engine upgrades or expert handling. You can upgrade the red action to a white action, but that's about it. Just a nice soft upgrade. If it's cheap enough, it'll see pretty consistent play. A pretty useful tool for your TIE Reapers or Decimators. Okay, moving on to a generic slot which we previously did not have in first edition. These are force upgrades, and I have actually spoken about these before, but in terms of the way they play around with the old car's design, heightened perception gives you the ability to definitely shoot first during the attack phase, and that's basically all the fair bits of veteran instincts that we are basically allowing ourselves to have in second edition, without the ability to give your ship more agency to fly last during the activation phase, which seems fair enough. Instinctive Aim is the replacement for Deadeye, except I think it's a much better card than Deadeye because you always have force tokens because you're putting this on a ship that's able to replenish those tokens. Deadeye needed to have focus tokens to work, which pretty much meant in most situations you need to take focus actions. So I think if there's any kind of alpha striking ordnance style force user, Instinctive Aim is going to be fantastic. Potentially Luke Skywalker I'm looking at in particular. Sense also kind of borrows that ability Intelligence Agent gave us, and I think that's a good thing. The Informant is a much more narrow version of Intel Agent, but Sense is that more broader version, and basically you always have the ability that Intel Agent gives you, except if you're only using it at range 0 to 1, you get to keep your force token. Apart from that, it's pretty much the same thing. You could argue that's less powerful, except I think this is a fantastic utility card. Again, I have to repeat, I think Intel Agent in first edition was a fantastic rate, so putting it on a slightly higher priority upgrade seems fair enough. Supernatural Reflex looks absolutely insane. On a small ship, before you activate, you may spend a force to perform a barrel roll or boost action. Then if you performed an action you do not have on your action bar, suffer 1 damage. This is kind of like a push the limits advanced sensor combo where you get more action economy and you get to boost or barrel roll before you move. This is going to be insane, and I think in terms of power level, it's going to be very telling how much this one cost. In fact, just while I'm here, just as an aside, I want to say I think in general, we're going to get a bit of a shock when we see the costings for all these upgrades. I think they're going to be a little bit more expensive than we all expect. I think the naysayers are going to naysay and say, oh no, this is no good, we can't do the builds we used to do. But I think FFG probably want to focus more on what kind of ships you're fielding rather than what kind of upgrades you're using. And Supernatural Reflexes, even in this very high priority slot in the Force upgrade slots, seems like it's going to be really potent, and I would not be surprised if this is 10 plus points. That's the prediction I'm going to make here, guys. I think this is absolutely nuts. I see a lot of people talking about this on generic Inquisitors, and I don't know if this is going to quite fit into a 3-of list. We'll have to wait and see, but yeah, that's just my predictions here. The card looks absolutely insane in terms of power level, unless it's super expensive to kind of counteract that. Okay, moving on to the Gunner slot, and this is basically a whole bunch of new upgrade cards that replaces Gunner from first edition. Instead of having various crew members that interact with the way you shoot, there's now a new upgrade slot in the Gunner card. Veteran Turret Gunner and Veteran Tail Gunner both give you extra shots. Veteran Turret Gunner in the turret and Veteran Tail Gunner in the rear firing arc. Very, very, very potent. But interestingly enough, we also have some utility cards that use this slot. Hotshot Gunner, while you perform a turret attack, after the modified defense dice step, the defender removes 1 focus or calculate token. And this is basically the offensive half of Hotshot Copilot, which seems alright, I guess. I do get the sense that this upgrade slot is going to be very high priority. So maybe Hotshot Gunner is meant to represent a cheaper option that's just okay. It'll get you over the line, but basically if you want the points, you probably want to spend it on something like a Veteran Turret Gunner, or if you're on the Rebel faction like Han or Bistan or something like that. I feel like there's a lot more power level in this slot, and this is going to have to be cheap enough to justify its spot. Skilled Bombardier replaces the old Bombardier ability, except you can change the speed of your bomb drops by 1 higher or lower, which is actually a massive upgrade on that old ability, and is going to interact very interestingly depending on what ships it can go on. It can go with Eamon Azamine if you take the Andraste title on the Fire Spray. If this slot's available on the Skirk Bomber, it's going to be fantastic with Sol Sigza. I think what's more likely though is we're going to see the Gunner slot on the K-Wing, and this is going to be an option for that, as well as things like Veteran Turret Gunner, because it also has a dual turret firing arc. Okay, moving on to the Illicits, and this is now firmly a 2-faction upgrade slot. There are now plenty of Rebel ships that can take this, as we have had confirmation that all the pilots in Swords Renegades can also take this upgrade slot. Cloaking Device has been made a little bit more consistent, where you get it on 2 charges. You can also take it on medium ships. So some of the ships that have been moved from large to medium can now take this, like the Fire Spray, for example. That could be interesting. And I think having those 2 charges is going to be a nice backup. It really hurts when you use this and it just breaks the first turn you use it. It feels like a massive waste of points. And also it still gets a bit of a boost if you have Jabba the Hutt in your faction. I don't think this is going to be nuts in terms of power level. I don't think this is a massive upgrade, but I like the consistency that's been given to this. Contraband Cybernetics looks absolutely insane. This has had an upgrade. I already love this card in first edition. Not taking that stress token seems like a really big deal. Now it's just a one-off thing that says, during this turn, you can do red maneuvers or perform actions while you're stressed. And maybe FFG just looked at the meta and thought, hey, this isn't really doing that much, we can give it a bit more of a push. And I think that's okay. Making it a bit less risky seems fine, especially if it's going to go on the Rebel faction. And to reflect this, it might cost more points to balance this out. So I can see why that's the kind of approach they might take. Consistency over risk seems to be a big common factor with all these upgrades. Dead Man's Switch is completely functionally the same and I think is still going to be as terrible as it was in first edition. But FFG seem to love this card, so yeah, whatever. Feedback array's been made a little bit better in that you no longer have to ping your own ship in order to use it, but instead of choosing one enemy ship at range 1, you now do it to every ship at range 0, which is very interesting. It actually makes it a little bit harder to use. But yeah, I don't know. I think there'll be some interesting bumper builds that can use this. Maybe the Jump Master has even more agency to use this. Maybe we're looking at the Quad Jumper. I think it has a nice combo with the Static Discharge Vanes. Yeah, seems really cool. Seems like taking away that downside makes this a bit more of a consistent card. Look, it never saw any crazy meta play in first edition, so I'll be interested to see how this one goes. Inertial Dampeners now no longer spends. You now have to remove a shield in order to use it, which is admittedly pretty significant downside. It means if you have no shields, you can't use this. But like the older Inertial Dampeners, I always found that the card sometimes had really excellent explosive use. And I think if that's still the case, if you're still using it and you find a great opportunity to use it, it is going to be worth a shield. I just think it's going to be worth using a little bit less of the time. Reed's Cargo Chute now also works on medium ships, so Skirg bombers and G1A starfighters can also take this bad boy. But it is worth noting that bombs have all moved to the system phase, but this guy still uses actions. Now, it doesn't drop a bomb that detonates or anything like that, but it still gets to interact with your initiative, which could be good. It could help you with map control. I don't think that's an insane ability, and I think making sure this is on the illicit slot rather than the bomb slot, it feels like that's the kind of slot that you can do that kind of stuff with. You get a bit more of these spiky, cheaty abilities, if that makes any sense. So that's cool. Nice to see this card still in second edition. Now let's move on to all the missiles, and these guys are really, really, really interesting. Basically, missiles have become weird utility ordnance. In first edition, both missiles and torps kind of had very powerful attacks and weird utility abilities. And the line was very blurred in terms of the design behind them, and now they're much more clear-cut. Missiles can do more versatile things, but torpedoes in general give you better attacks. Cluster missiles, for example, works very similarly to the way it did in first edition. Instead, you use that second attack against another ship at range 0 to 1 of the defender. I think that gives you a lot more firepower, and just having two of the same attack didn't really feel like a very clustery kind of thing to do. I feel like this is a great utility to have against swarms. It's going to be terrible against aces, and that's fair enough. Maybe you'll take this alongside another missile to try and balance out a list. Concussion Missile now exposes the face-up damage card of every ship at range 0 to 1 of the defender after it's used, which is kind of like Assault Missile, except even more spiky because you're exposing damage cards, which means you can play around with some really crazy game effects, which feels a lot of fun. Homing Missile is a big 4 dice attack at range 2 to 3, except the defender can just choose to take 1 damage instead of having to suffer the effects of this attack, and that leads me to think that this might be relatively cheap compared to all these other missiles. But basically it means you'll hit more consistently, which was what homing missiles is all about. Ion Pulse missiles are just now ion missiles, and they have this overflow ion effect. We've talked about this already. Basically, after you hit someone with this 3 dice attack at range 2 to 3, they only suffer 1 of those damage, and all the overflow damage from that point on gets converted into ion tokens. And this gives you agency to get multiple ion tokens in a ship. So if you're facing against large ships, you still have some ability to get those 3 ion tokens onto them. And Proton Rockets now no longer plays around with agility. It's just a 5 dice attack at range 1 to 2 inside the bullseye firing arc. So it's still narrow in terms of its use, it requires good flying, but thankfully it also does not require you to have a target lock, which gives it a bit more upside. Also, all of these attacks now no longer require you to spend target locks. We saw this with the Harpoon Missile in first edition, and thank the maker we do not have Harpoon Missile in the game anymore. But it didn't really make sense to spend target locks. I don't know why a ship's computer would have to lose a target lock in order to spend ordnance. They never really made sense in the first edition of X-Wing. And it means all of these cards also have the added upside of being able to get those rerolls off the target lock, which is really, really cool. Also, apart from Proton Rockets, they all have multiple shots, denoted by the amount of charges on their card. Alright, we have a lot of modifications to talk about, so let's talk about Ablative Plating. This is essentially an updated version of Deflective Plating, which now can go onto any medium or large ship. Before you would suffer damage from an obstacle or from a friendly bomb detonating, you may spend 1 charge if you do prevent 1 damage, which feels like a great utility card. I don't think this guy's going to be cheap, especially on the Scum faction with Genius. We have to be very careful about that potential combo, but I think FFG will get around that by simply pricing this out. This seems like a really good utility card, especially if your list is heavy with bombing, and it seems fair to take this off the BSF-17 bomber and put it onto every ship. It doesn't really make sense that that ability would only be on 1 ship. Afterburners replaces auto thrusters, and despite the fact the design is completely different, it is clearly trying to tell us what kind of design we're wanting to see in 2nd edition. We don't get automatic dice mods on defense. We don't get to prolong the game with that kind of stuff. You get more agency with your small aces to dodge. Now any small ship can take free boosts if they execute a 3 to 5 speed maneuver, which feels really, really powerful. It's going to give aces a lot more agency to move around and really play offense or defense when necessary. A great card moving forward. Electronic Baffle has moved off the system slot and into the modification slot. During the end phase, you may suffer 1 damage to remove 1 red token. And this is playing around with the same space the old one did. This is also giving you agency to remove any of your red tokens. Also, it's giving this ability to any ship, and I think that's fair enough. Big ships are going to like this, aces are going to stay away from this because damage is really not what they want. And I still think in the case of big ships with lots of health, there has to be a really good reason to be wanting to continually get rid of red tokens. Engine upgrades, like all the other cards that used to do this, no longer just gives you a free action. You now upgrade your red boost to a white boost. Seems fair enough, might even be cheaper. It'll be interesting to see how much this one's costed. Hull upgrade and shield upgrade function exactly the same, except they have this new art style of having the little hull and shield upgrade symbol with the plus. Munitions failsafe functions pretty much exactly the same as the old one, except the old one really was confusing in terms of its design because it's saying you don't have to discard your ordnance card unless your attack hits. But by the time your attack hits, you've already discarded the card. So the timing on that was always kind of confusing in my eyes. And this one just says if you miss, you get to recover the charge that you used. Makes perfect sense. Functionally exactly the same, except the timing is all neatened up. And the wording feels less confusing to me. Ion discharges has been replaced with static discharge veins. This ability can now go onto any faction, which is really cool. If you would gain an ion or jam token, you may choose a ship at range 0 to 1. If you do, gain 1 stress token and transfer 1 ion or jam token to that ship. So it's more consistent, but there is the added downside of having to gain a stress token. However, for ion control, that's fantastic. Now there is no agency for your opponent to prevent them from getting that ion token or jam token, and that feels really, really good to me. Plus, there's a really weird interaction on this card. If you already have an ion or jam token, as long as you get either an ion or jam token from that point on, you can actually transfer the token you didn't just receive. In other words, if you say have a jam token and you just get an ion token, you can actually transfer that jam token because it does not say that you have to specifically transfer the token that you just received. A little bit more versatility. I don't know how often that's going to be relevant, but that is an interaction that card has. Stealth device functions exactly the same, except it breaks after any damage is dealt. Seems fair enough. This was always really annoying on aces. They could go, oh, well, I flew over a rock or hit by a bomb, but my stealth device is still up, so no. Yeah, just more consistent against more different playstyles. Seems fair enough. Tactical Scrambler now works on any medium or large ships, so some of the smaller ships that have been upgraded now get this card. While you obstruct an enemy ship attack, the defender rolls 1 additional defense die. Interesting, the old one said you may obstruct attacks. Now, I think the language that we're using from now on says that anything is obstructed if it's in the way, but only rocks means you get 1 additional defense die. Which is interesting because we're having a bit of confusion over the card Kira that comes in Lando's Millennium Falcon because it talks about obstructed attacks. And the contention here is even if you're ignoring rocks, is the attack still obstructed, which kind of mean this either does or doesn't work with the Han Solo pilot card, and the way Tactical Scrambler is worded seems to indicate that everything is always obstructed. It just matters whether or not you interact with the obstructed objects. So this means in my eyes the Kira card probably does work with the Han Solo pilot all the time, just based on the wording we're seeing, so that helps to clear some of that up in my eyes. The generic system slots have been shaved down to basically the 4 most relevant ones that we used in first edition, plus electronic baffle still exists on the modification slot. Advanced sensors is a functional reprint. Collision detector, while you boost or barrel roll you can move through or overlap obstacles. After you move through or overlap an obstacle, you may spend 1 charge to ignore the effects until the end of turn, which is cool. The ability's a bit more broad, you're not just ignoring those crits, and this also means, unless I'm very much mistaken, you can shoot on a rock, so a much more broad ability. I think this is definitely going to be more than 0 points, absolutely a more powerful card, unless this is curtailed by points, which I think it will be. Fire control system no longer nets you free target locks, it just gives you more agency if you already have a target lock, which feels really good. I mean, if you only wanted to reroll 1 attack die anyway, this is way better because you no longer lose your lock. It means you then cannot use the lock afterwards, but I think in most scenarios you probably wouldn't have wanted to do both of these effects anyway. It feels very similar to the old fire control systems where you basically always keep re-rolling and using up your locks because you're going to get them back anyway, where we've curtailed it to just 1 re-roll, but that still feels pretty good in my eyes. It's basically a pseudo Predator on any ship with a system upgrade as long as they want to take target locks. Feels good to me. And Trajectory Simulator works the same way it always did, except it only ever works during the system phase. Definitely no interaction with Genius. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, FFG. Let's make sure that is clear and never see that again. Alright, moving on to the Torpedoes. So these guys are all about just big stonking attacks. Advanced Proton Torpedoes and Proton Torpedoes actually work exactly the same way. They're just big dumb attacks that allow you to change 1 hit to a crit. The Advanced Proton Torpedoes is 5 dice at range 1 at the front arc with just 1 charge, and the regular Proton Torpedoes is much more versatile with 4 red dice at range 2 to 3, but has 2 charges. And Ion Torpedoes is now the same as the Ion Turret, where you get this big attack, but you only make your opponent suffer 1 hit and all the overflow damage turns into Ion, again giving you a lot of agency to try and lock down your opponent's ship. I think this is going to be better in general against bigger ships because you just need more dice to try and ionize those ships. And having 2 charges is good. I just hope this doesn't cost too much. One of the biggest problems with Ordnance was they always were a bit costly for a one-off effect. And then when they got fixed with guidance chips and extra munitions, they became too powerful. So hopefully if FFG tweak the points on these just right, they'll just have enough agency to have good consistent play. We only have 2 turrets in the game, Dorsal turret and Ion Cannon turret. Dorsal turret's very similar to the way it always used to work. In fact, it's basically exactly the same. Instead, both of these give you the move turret arc. It just says attack, which I think is lovely and clean. Basically, anything without that little missile symbol does give you range bonuses. So although it doesn't say on the card, yes, you get the extra dice at range 1, that is already implied. And the Ion Cannon turret is 3 red dice. But again, the Ion effect, suffer 1 damage plus all overflow turns into Ion. Very good versatile card. This was a great card in first edition, frankly. It just didn't see play because for one more point you get access to twin laser turret, which was just dumb and broken and we never want to see that again. But this is a lot of fun. I'll be interested to see whether this can see consistent play and control builds. And there is one more slot for me to talk about, guys, the talent slot, but I'm going to leave those for another video because there is simply so many of them to go through. I definitely think it's worth just focusing on them in one single video. In the meantime, guys, thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe, like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter and Reddit, and I will catch you guys later.